Good morning, students. So, we are back to the lecture on history of Indian cinema. In the last classes, we were discussing the Indian cinema during 1930s and 40s. So, in this class, I wish to explore a bit more about the Indian cinema during 1930s and 40s. I thought that I will give you some more aspects of Indian cinema during 1930s and 40s. And I thought that I will elaborate a little more about the studio era. So, we talked about three major studios here. One was Prabhatt Film Studio, the other was New Theatres, and the third one was Bombay Talkies. So, I thought I will give you little more explanation about these studios which changed the face of Indian cinema. So it should be said that film production in 1920s and 30s were actually organized along lines similar to to Hollywood. So in Hollywood we see that a studio bore the entire cost of a film's production and had technicians and actors as full-time contracted employees. Studios in Hollywood became known for specializing in specific genre of films. So now Indian studio system too followed the lines similar to Hollywood. So they started bearing the cost of film production and they had technicians and actors as full time contracted employees. But we should say that, unlike Hollywood, a handful of studios did not succeed in monopolizing the film business, and the majority of Indian studios did not control distribution and exhibition like their Hollywood counterparts. So the Hollywood studios had control over distribution even distribution and exhibition were under the control of Hollywood studios. So there was this lack of integration between production, distribution, and exhibition. Indian studios had control only over film production, while Hollywood studios had control over film production, distribution, and exhibition. So there was this lack of integration between production, distribution, and exhibition, which accounted for the decline of studios, where there was a series of commercial failures and it ultimately led to bankruptcy. So, what is referred to as studio era was actually a short chapter in the history of Indian cinema. So, we have four important studios. One is Imperial Films Company, it was in Bombay. Prabhatt Film Company, it was in Pune. New Theatres in Calcutta, and Bombay Talkies. While Imperial film companies was actually significant for its efforts at technological innovations. The other three, Prabhatt Film Company, New Theatres, and Bombay Talkies, played an important role in training some of the important directors and actors of the 1950s and 60s, thus laying the foundation for post independence Hindi cinema. So, the first one is Imperial Films Company. So, when we talk about established studio, we usually avoid Imperial Films Company, which was only there for a short period. But it is, as I said earlier, it is noted for all those technological innovations it brought out. So this studio was established by Ardesh Rivani in 1928, and it functioned until 1938. And this Imperial Film Company was organized as a vertically integrated with its own exhibition infrastructure, and it was closely associated with this costumed historical genre, that is Alam Ara. It was Imperial Film Companies and also India's first sound feature. It was a period fantasy based on a popular Parsi theatre play about a young girl named Alam Ara who exposes an evil queen's schemes and saves a kingdom. India's top two stars from the silent era, that is Sulojana and Subeda, were actually under contract with the Imperial Films Company, as was a young Prithviraj Kapoor, who would become one of the stars of pre-independence Hindi cinema and literally established an acting dynasty of Kapoor family. Many of these films produced by Imperial Film Company were actually remake of its own silent hits. Imperial made films in at least, it is said that in 9 languages: Hindi, Urdu, Gujarati, Marathi, Tamil, Telugu, Malay, Burmese, and Pashto. In 1929, it became the first studio in India to shoot scenes at night using incandescent lights. And it was the first studio to produce indigenously processed color film. That was our first color film, Kisan Kanya, in the year 1937. Imperial also produced the first Farsi language sound feature in 1933. That was Dukatar Elur. And thus an aspect of Iranian film history can be traced to Bombay. Next studio, it is Prabhatt Film Company. It was established in 1929 in southwestern Maharashtrian town of Kolhapur as a partnership between 5 individuals who had previously worked together in Maharashtra Film Company. And later, Prabhatt Film Company moved to Pune, the second largest city in Maharashtra, in 1933, where it became India's Western India's premier studio with a national reputation. Prabhan had many stars on its payroll, had its own processing labs, well-equipped sound and editing departments, the largest stage floor in India, and an art department regarded as the country's best. Its style of filmmaking was influenced by the popular Marathi musical theatre tradition known as Sangeet Nadak, and many of its early films were remakes of Maharashtrian film repertoire. Prabhat had its first major hit with Amrut Mandan, which came out in the year 1934, which was directed by V. Shandara, who actually became one of the most celebrated Indian directors in the 1930s. It was a strongly political film about a people's revolt set against a backdrop of a kingdom where the conflict is between a rationalist king and a ritualistic priest. The studio also pioneered new successful genres such as sane films. Sane films are actually all those biographical films about popular poet saints from the 16th and 17th century. So we have this Sant Tukaram, which is revered as a great Indian film. It was actually the first Indian film to receive international recognition. It was adjudged one of the three best films of the world at Venice Film Festival. It was actually a runaway success and broke the box office records by being the first Indian film to run in a single theatre for more than a year. And it became the archetype for devotional films. So I will show you a clip on this particular film.
आनिक मदनाई आता आनिक निमिलिया चित्ता पानिया पांडुरंग ज्ञानी पांडुरंग ज्ञानी पांडुरंग मणि पांडुरंग ज्ञानी जागृति स्वप्नी पांडुरंग पांडुरंग ज्ञानी पांडुरंग मने पांडुरंग ध्यानी पडिले वळण इंद्रिया सकला पडिले वळण इंद्रिया सकला भाव तो निराळा निराळा भाव तो निराळा नाही तुझा पांडुरंग ज्ञानी पांडुरंग ज्ञानी पांडुरंग बने पांडुरंग ज्ञानी तुका म्हणे नेत्री केली ओळखण तुका म्हणे नेत्री
So that's a clip on Sant Tukara. So it was Prabhatt Film Company which started with all those same films. And Prabhat's success was also due to good distribution arrangements and long-term contract they had with exhibitors. It eventually took on distribution itself and built its own theatres in Bombay, Pune, and Madras. Later, Prabhatt Talkies lost its premier director, V. Shantaram, in 1942. So he broke away from Prabhatt Film Company and he started his own studio in Bombay. Though Prabhatt Film Company continued producing films even after the departure of V. Shantaram, the studio finally closed in 1953. And I have mentioned it earlier that its premises now form the campus of Film and Television Institute of India. The other studio, it is the other regional studio with a national reputation. It is New Theatres. It was founded by B.N. Sarkar in 1931. Unlike Imperial and Prabhat studios, which produced silent films prior to their changeover to sound films, New Theatre from its inception was a sound studio. It was the most elite of Bengal studios and as such attracted significant technical and creative talent from several smaller silent studios which was which were on the brink of bankruptcy. Many of the films made by this studio was based on Bengali novels, and the studio aimed for the cinematic equivalent of literature. Whereas the other studios usually only hired one director, new theaters had many directors as well as the major star of the 1930s, that is Kundan Lal Saigal. It is 1930s, I made a mistake, it is not 1939s, it is 1930s. It also invested considerably in technological innovations, and the technique of playback singing was first introduced by the studio in 1935 in the film Doob Chand, Sunlight Shadow. One of the studio's most significant film was Devdas, PC Barwas Devdas, which was made both in Bengali and Hindi. But once its key director, that is, he was Nitin Bose, he resigned in 1941 and new theatre's success started to decline. Since the studio never established its own distribution outlets, the rise of markets in western and southern India actually quickened its decline. And at the end, New Theatres sold many of its film rights to distributors at a loss and was finally closed in 1955. Fourth theatre, it is Bombay Talkies. It was among the largest pre-World War II sound studios in India and introduced some of the major stars and directors who became the face of post-independence Hindi cinema. They were Devanand, Raj Kapoor, Ashok Kumar, Dilip Kumar. Bombay Talkies was founded by Himanshu Rai in 1934, and it was the only major studio established as a full-fledged corporate body with a board of directors that included prominent business leaders of Bombay. It was one of the first studios with backing from major financial institutions, paying a regular dividend to shareholders from its third year onwards. And Himanshu Rai was also involved in successful Indo-German co-productions during the silent era, and much of the studio's early technical team, like director, cameraman, set designer, sound engineers, they were all imported from Germany. After Himanshu Rai's death, his wife Devika Rani took over as the production controller, and the studio produced one of the biggest hits of the pre-independence era, that is Kismet, which came out in 1943. So it was a crime thriller about a pickpocket being united with his long lost family. So it was one of the super hit films biggest hits in the pre-independence era. So we will have a look at a song from Kismet. I have actually discussed this song when I talked about 1940s cinema in the last class.
आज हिमालय की चोटी से फिर हमने ललकारा है, आज हिमालय की चोटी से फिर हमने ललकारा है। दूर हटो दूर हटो दूर हटो है दुनिया वालों, हिंदुस्तान हमारा है। दूर हटो है दुनिया वालों, हिंदुस्तान हमारा है।
ताजमहल है और कुतुब मीनारा है,
जहाँ हमारा ताजमहल है और कुतुब मीनारा है।
जहाँ हमारे मंदिर मस्जिद सिखों का गुरुद्वारा है,
जहाँ हमारे मंदिर मस्जिद सिखों का गुरुद्वारा है। जहाँ हमारा ताजमहल है और कुतुब मीनारा है, जहाँ हमारे मंदिर मस्जिद सिखों का गुरुद्वारा है।
धरती पर कदम बढ़ाना अत्याचार तुम्हारा है,
अत्याचार तुम्हारा है। दूर हटो दूर हटो दूर हटो वालों, हिंदुस्तान है। दूर हटो दुनिया वालों, हिंदुस्तान हमारा है। आज हिमालय की चोटी से फिर हमने ललकारा है, आज हिमालय की चोटी से फिर हमने ललकारा है। दूर हटो दूर हटो दूर हटो है दुनिया वालों, हिंदुस्तान हमारा है। हुआ है जंग तुम्हारा, जाग उठो हिंदुस्तानी, तुम न किसी के आगे झुकना, जर्मन हो या जापानी। शुरू हुआ है जंग तुम्हारा, जाग उठो हिंदुस्तानी, तुम न किसी के आगे झुकना, जर्मन हो या जापानी। आज सभी के लिए हमारा यही कौमी नारा है, आज सभी के लिए हमारा यही कौमी नारा है। दूर हटो दूर हटो दूर हटो है दुनिया वालों, हिंदुस्तान हमारा है। दूर हटो है दुनिया वालों, हिंदुस्तान हमारा है। आज हिमालय की चोटी से फिर हमने ललकारा है, आज हिमालय की चोटी से फिर हमने ललकारा है। दूर हटो दूर हटो दूर हटो।
So that was the biggest hit of pre-independence era. I have discussed the same film in the last class too, when we talked about 1940s, all those war films, all those censorship. I will deal it in a little more detailed manner. So coming back to Bombay Talkies. So after this biggest hit, Kismet, Bombay Talkies was dealt with a blow when some of its most successful members, including the star, director, and producer of Kismet, broke away from the studio to form another studio, which is Filmistan. Along with that, Devika Rani retired from filmmaking in 1945, and by the early 1950s, the studio went to decline. Though its workers' association tried to save it, Bombay Talkies produced its last film in 1954. We have two more noteworthy studios based in Bombay. One was Ranjit Movie Tone, the other one was Badia Movie Tone. Ranjit Movie Tone was established in 1929 by Chandulal Shah and stayed active until the late 1960s. It was best known in its early years for mid-budget socials, satires, and stunt-derived mythologicals. The studio flourished in the early sound era with an assembly line approach to production and was India's biggest producer of films until the 1950s. Vadia Movie Tone was founded by JBH Vadia and Homi Vadia. Vadia Movie Tone, I have discussed Vadia Movie Tone when I talked about Fearless Nadia phenomenon. So, Vadia Movie Tone was most famous for its stunt or action films starring this Nadia. So she was actually a Australian born former circus performer of mixed Welsh Greek parentage. Her real name was Mary Evans. And Vadia Movie Tone sold their studio premises to Shantaram in 1942, who converted them to Raj Kamal Kala Mandir.